There are two psychotherapeutic modalities that are evidence-based for OCD. One is called exposure with response prevention, or ERP, and the second is called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. We're going to talk a little bit more about exposure therapy here. Exposure therapy is a fancy way of saying that we ask you to face your fears and not do the rituals that you would normally do in order to escape the feeling of anxiety that will result. What we know about anxiety is that it's kind of like a wave. And what happens in OCD is as you get triggered by something that makes you anxious and your anxiety rises, you do a ritual right at the top of that anxiety peak, and it makes you feel better right away. And then your brain starts to realize that that's how you feel better, that you do this ritual right when your anxiety gets highest, and then you feel better. But unfortunately, that creates a cycle where you have to do the ritual over and over and over again to feel better. So in order for us to break that cycle, we actually ask you to encounter anxiety-provoking things. And when you do, we ask that your anxiety go up and you not do anything about it, and you let it ride until it ultimately comes down on its own. What we know about anxiety is that it will come down on its own. And if you let it take its natural course, over time you won't get as anxious and it will come down much more quickly than previously. And that's something called habituation. So let's use an example. So let's pretend that you're somebody who's worried about getting sick. And every time you touch a doorknob, you have to wash your hands in a very ritualistic way. Let's say you have to wash them 12 times, and each time you wash them, you have to use 4 pumps of soap and a different towel every time you dry it. Now, if we're doing exposure therapy, we're going to ask you to create something called a hierarchy, sort of a fancy way of saying a list. And we're going to ask you different questions, like how hard would it be to touch the doorknob and only wash your hands 11 times? Or how hard would it be to touch the doorknob and wash 12 times but only use 3 pumps of soap each time? And you would give us a rating between 0 and 10 about how hard you think that would be, 10 being the hardest and 0 being the easiest. And then you pick the easiest, and we'd go ahead and try it. And let's pretend the easiest is that you touch the doorknob and you wash 11 times, but during that 11 times, you're using 4 pumps of soap and a different towel each time. And you're keeping the ritual the same except for that very last part. And we are going to ask that you sit with the anxiety from not doing the ritual all the way to completion. And you let the anxiety come down on its own. And we ask you to do that over and over and over again until washing your hands 11 times is no big deal. You don't even miss the 12th time anymore. And that's ultimately how exposure therapy works. Over time, we tick away at the ritual until you feel comfortable that, you know what, you might get sick from touching the doorknob, but you don't need to use the ritual to feel better. That ultimately your anxiety does not peak up here, but it peaks down here, and it feels so much more manageable. In addition to these psychotherapeutic modalities, medication management can be useful in order to get you going. For some people, the anxiety is so high just thinking about doing exposure that medicines can be useful, but that's not true of everyone. And it turns out that psychotherapeutic modalities on their own can be incredibly effective for people.